Hello, everyone. It's Professor Buzzkill busting myths, taking names, and we're going to bust big myths today because one of the things about the Civil War that people don't understand, the American Civil War anyway, is the fact that slave trading keeps going on during the war. Now, I don't necessarily mean the Atlantic slave trade, slaves coming over on ships, but actually slave trading within the Confederacy. And fortunately for you, we have on the line Dr. Robert Colby, whose new book, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South, is just out, and he's willing to enlighten me, as he has through the book, and willing to enlighten you through this podcast. Dr. Colby, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, I think, especially when I teach American history, I sort of leave this topic off the discussion of the Civil War. I mean, we tell people about the abolition of the slave trade, Atlantic slave trade, and the British are in theory policing that and all that sort of stuff. And we talk about slaves being sold off plantations, sometimes as punishment. But I think the way we discuss it, it's sort of like an individual thing. There's one or two, and, there aren't very many. You show that it's an internal slave trade and traffic in slaves, and it's big.
Yeah, so the internal slave trade, the trade in enslaved people within the United States has loomed larger and larger in the ways that we've studied American slavery in the past few decades. Pioneering works by people like Walter Johnson, Michael Tadman, more recently Ed Baptist, Joshua Rothman, Dinah Barry, have really come to show how central the large-scale movement of people through the domestic slave trade was to the institution of slavery. We don't have exact numbers, but somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000, perhaps as many as 1 million people moved south through the domestic slave trade between the Revolution and the Civil War. This is something that not only drives the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, but reinvigorates and gives slavery a lifeline in places where it had not been flourishing. The common sort of refrain we hear when we talk about the Revolutionary era is that many of the founders believed slavery was dying out. And there is some truth to that slavery had become less economically viable in places like the Chesapeake.
Mm-hmm.
But the ability that the domestic slave trade offers slaveholders throughout the United States to sell people to the cotton frontier, the place where enslaved people are the most valuable and where they are increasingly valuable across the 19th century, allows the institution of slavery to hang on, economically reinvigorates it, and we should always be clear, is a defining aspect in the experience of the people enslaved in the American South. And so this wasn't the story that historians told about American slavery for a long time, but increasingly over the last few decades, it has been central to the way we talk about enslavement in the United States.
Well, let's start with 1860 because most people, including me, again, I keep admitting to my own failures here, Buzzkillers. When I talk about 1860 and secession, I'm usually talking about it in a survey class, and I skip over what's known as the Panic of 1860, and you show quite clearly how important that is exactly to this internal slave trade.
This was something that surprised me in doing this research because I like you, had mostly considered secession as a political phenomenon, which is fair. It very much is. But the political phenomenon of secession ripples through American society. And one of the effects that it has is it creates vast uncertainty. And, if we know anything, financial markets loathe uncertainty. There are other effects. There are serious questions over whether Southern creditors, for example, will pay the debts that they owe to Northern financial institutions. And all of this creates, and the word is so apt, what we would call a financial crisis, people in the 19th century called a panic, right?
Yeah.
And it is a very real panic in the sense that what it really creates is, as people call in loans and as people refuse to extend further credit to potential borrowers, the liquidity on which the 19th century economy depends just dries up. There's no cash to be had. There's no credit available. This has a profound effect on trade of all kinds, including the trade in enslaved people. So we were talking right about how this isn't something that we usually talk about when we talk about the Civil War. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, which we can get into. But one of the reasons is that there's a widespread assumption that the slave trade disappears during the Civil War because, of course, why would anyone in their right mind buy or sell an enslaved person during that conflict?
Yeah.
And part of the reason that we think that is that secession offers the appearance that this would be the case. The slave trade drops dramatically during the secession crisis. Slave traders, people who trade and enslave people professionally, they are panicked in many cases. They bewail the diminishing of their business. And it's easy to read that, especially in the context of the election of Abraham Lincoln, a president chosen from an avowedly anti slavery party, which fits so well with the rhetoric of white Southerners about what they believe will happen to the institution of slavery should a Republican be elected. What we glaze over is that the reason that the slave trade dries up is not so much because of a lack of confidence in the institution of slavery. In fact, that's almost nowhere in the correspondence that I read in this period. Rather, it's purely the mechanics of the business. There's no money to be had to buy or sell an enslaved person.
Yeah.
There's simply too much uncertainty in the market. Slaveholders traditionally bought enslaved people in the fall and winter. They often relied on credit drawn against the next year's crop to do that. When there's no credit in the market, you can't buy or sell a person.
Mm.
And so this really was critical to me in rethinking this period, that it's not a crisis of confidence in slavery. It's just a simple inability, an economic inability to acquire the people that white Southerners might otherwise have wanted to acquire.
Yes, but you show that it's slightly different than, the credit crunch for moving grain and things like that. There are different aspects to it that make it more than just, if you will, standard commodity trading.
It's true. And of course, the crux that lies at the heart of not only the slave trade, but slavery writ large is what, Walter Johnson, following J.W.C. Pennington, calls the chattel principle, that an enslaved person is both a person and a form of property at the same time. And reconciling those two things is something white Southerners find very difficult. So, of course, there are concerns about the future of slavery, but that's so closely bound up with the creation of the Confederacy, of an independent slaveholding republic. And arguably, it's not usually made explicit, but implicitly, one of the reasons that the Confederacy is created is to preserve that value, the value resting in enslaved people.
Yeah. So what happens to slave traders and the slave trade, internal slave trade, in those first couple of years?
So there is a tremendous amount of fluctuation in the slave trade in the first years of the war, but that establishes patterns that will continue throughout the remainder of the conflict. The slave trade diminishes significantly in the first couple of months of the war for the simple reason that it takes a back seat to the various other crises the Confederates are facing.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the men who had been doing the groundwork of the slave trade, moving people from one place to another, buying and selling people, go into the Confederate Army, as such a huge percentage of the white male population of the South will ultimately do. The financial problems created by the secession crisis continue, and white Southerners struggle to reconcile those and deal with them in the early years of the war. And then there's simply the question of, what is this conflict going to look like? Is it going to be the brief conflict that many people expect it to be? Or is it going to be a long, drawn out conflict that's going to result in widespread devastation? That uncertainty certainly influences the slave market in the early months of the war. What you see, though, is that as the Confederacy establishes itself, as it has some early military successes, people's confidence in slavery, white Southerners' belief that they will not be swiftly subdued, takes hold, and you start to see the slave market rebounding, particularly by the winter of 1861 heading into 1862. In a place like New Orleans, for example, it reaches almost precisely the same levels it had in the months heading into secession. There's a remarkable restoration of the slave trade in a city like New Orleans, for example. And that's true in spite of the fact that the cotton economy has been shattered, in spite of the fact cotton exports from New Orleans, which was one of the primary ports for the Mississippi River Valley dropped by more than 98% in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
first year of the war. And so, at some level, the fact that there's slave trading at all, much less significant slave trading, is kind of remarkable and says something about how white Southerners view not only their own prospects, but view the place of slavery in the society they're trying to build.
But then you point out that 1862 is a big deal. It's a big change. Now, I don't
Mhm.
want to say more of the question because you're the expert, but it's almost as if one can say to someone in your field, just say 1862, and then
Mhm.
everything falls in. I mean, everything flows from that. The date itself
Yeah.
is enough to explain what's going on.
Oh, absolutely. So 1862 is a complete roller coaster for the domestic slave trade. On the one hand, the first months of 1862, the first half of 1862 really is an absolute catastrophe for the Confederacy.
Hmm.
Civil War students will know that this is when you see the rise of Ulysses S. Grant, Union victories at Fort Henry and Donelson, in the Western Theater at Shiloh, the Union advance both down and up the Mississippi River that ultimately and critically for the story that I'm telling of the slave trade results in the fall of cities like New Orleans, which had been the headquarters of the American slave trade. Union forces arrive in New Orleans at the beginning of May 1862 and pretty much eradicate the domestic slave trade in what had been the antebellum South's largest slave market. They do similar things in cities like Nashville and Memphis that fall into Union hands in the first half of 1862. And to make things even worse for the Confederacy, the first half of that year, you have the Union military in the Eastern Theater in Virginia slowly but surely grinding its way towards Richmond. By the end of June, the Army of the Potomac, a 100,000 man force, is sitting 6 miles from the city of Richmond, the Confederate capital, and its second largest slave trading center. And throughout all of this, the slave trade drops dramatically, both because of the physical challenges imposed by fighting, mobilizing and fighting for war, as well as by the fact that many people simply think there's a chance this war will be over in the first half of 1862.
Hmm.
There are Richmond slave traders who had sold dozens of people per month heading into the Civil War, and they might sell one or two in March, April, May 1862. And then things change dramatically. There are any number of Civil War historians who will argue that the summer of 1862 is one of the hinge points of the war, particularly thanks to Robert E. Lee's victories in the 7 Days battles, which remove the Union threat to Richmond, drive McClellan in defeat to sort of a neutered position on the Virginia Peninsula, followed by victories at Cedar Mountain, Second Manassas, and ultimately culminating in the Confederate invasion of Maryland. It's a radical change, not only in the military situation of the war, but in Confederate understandings of their prospects for victory. They go from sort of the lowest of the low to thinking that not only are their odds pretty good, but they now have an invincible army and an invincible commander in the person of Robert E. Lee. And you see this reflected in the slave market. The slave market in Richmond, which after the fall of New Orleans is the most important market in the Confederacy, absolutely rebounds in the wake of the 7 Days. Almost immediately after the Union Army is removed from the immediate environs of the city, you have slaveholders bringing people to the city to sell. You have slave traders pointing out that they're open for business again. And by the winter of 1862, after Antietam, particularly after the Confederate victory at Fredericksburg, you have this Confederate enthusiasm that is reflected in demand for enslaved people that is approaching the levels that had existed before the Civil War. It's a really remarkable transition you see in 1862, and what you see is how closely linked the ebbs and flows of the slave trade are to Confederate ebbs and flows in confidence in their victory. If they win, slave trading is a totally viable enterprise. They're acquiring human property that will be immensely valuable after the war. When that confidence diminishes, so does the slave trade in many cases. And 1862 shows that so clearly, I think.
Well, let me ask you, maybe this is sort of a step backward, but I think it sort of contextualizes a lot of this because, you've been talking about slave markets. And I think for most people, we think that the slave markets were for slaves coming off the Atlantic slave trade. They
Mhm.
arrive in these big ports, New Orleans, and they're put on a slave dock, and then they go into the interior, if you will. And if there is slave trading within the Confederacy, or within the South, I should say, before Civil War, it's sort of an individual deal, a personal deal between slave owners. But you show in the book again, which again, Buzzkillers, this is just eye-opening stuff, that a lot of these slave markets have slaves from the interior. People are sending
Mhm.
their slaves off the plantation in Tennessee down to New Orleans to be sold there, rather than try to sell them, locally, if you will. That's just
Mhm.
fascinating. That's just
Oh
absolutely
yeah.
fascinating.
So yeah, after 1808, the internal slave trade it's not the only slave trade in the United States, but it is by far the dominant form. We don't know how many, just to sort of perspective, we don't know how many people slave traders illegally import to the United States from Africa. The best number I've seen is probably close to 50,000 across the period between 1808 and the Civil War. Obviously, it's an illegal traffic, so no one is keeping really good numbers.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But again, that represents maybe 1/16 of the people traded in the United States. The overwhelming, by far the dominant form of slave trading in the United States is the internal slave trade. Again, has such critical effect on the evolution of slavery in the United States, not least of which is it creates a relative community of interest amongst Southern slaveholders. That is to say, if slaveholders in Mississippi, in Louisiana, and eventually Arkansas and Texas want to acquire enslaved people, they rely on Virginians and Tennesseans and Marylanders and so forth and so on to sell them those people, which means that the prices that Texans are willing to pay is functionally the value that Virginians can apply to the people they enslaved. It makes enslaved people incredibly valuable within the United States, in part because there's a relatively limited supply. It's the people enslaved and frankly, the expected children that they will have. And so the closure of the African slave trade in 1808 raises the value of all the people enslaved in the United States by constricting the supply. I will just say this, there had been a movement among South Carolinians, particularly to reopen the African slave trade in the 1850s.
Yeah.
This has a number of different forms. Part of it is an ideological defense of slavery. Part of it is an effort to democratize slavery. As enslaved people grew more and more expensive, they grew more and more concentrated as well in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And South Carolinians particularly worried that this represented a long-term threat to the institution of slavery in the United States. The Confederate Constitution, however, maintains the ban on the Atlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
The Confederate Constitution, as it's initially passed, is passed during the Secession crisis. And the Constitution is created at a moment when there are actually more slave states remaining in the United States than there are in the Confederacy.
Right.
And so what the Confederate Constitution does is it says the Confederacy will not permit the importation of enslaved people from Africa, which there were delegates at the Constitutional Convention who wanted. But we will allow the importation of enslaved people from outside the Confederacy, by which they basically mean Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, the states that are slaveholding states that have not yet seceded.
Right. We should remind everyone there's a two-stage secession process. There's what I call the secession seven, the first seven that go, and then if you will, the more bordering states then join.
Exactly. And arguably, right, we could say it's a three-stage process because there are four slaveholding states that never
Well,
secede:
yeah, yeah.
Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. The Confederate Constitution bans the African slave trade, allows the importation of enslaved people essentially from the parts of the United States that have not yet seceded, but there's sort of the carrot, right? This is a carrot and a stick approach by the Confederacy. They're trying to offer to Virginia, to Maryland, to North Carolina and Tennessee and Missouri, and all the slaveholding states that have not yet seceded. They're saying, look, we're not going to diminish the value of the people you enslaved by reopening the African slave trade.
Mm-hmm.
And we will continue to trade enslaved people with you. But the Confederate Constitution has a clause that says that the Constitution can ban the importation of slaves from any of these states, which is the stick, right? It's a stick that says, you can join with us, you can secede and be part of this, or we could conceivably cut off the trade in slaves that we practice with you, which will severely diminish the value of the people you hold in slavery. And so the slave trade is sort of again, both an incentive and a weapon that's at the hands of the Confederacy as they're trying to build themselves.
Yeah, and that shows, among other things, there's no bottom to the amount of stuff you can study here. Just the question of an internal slave trade versus an external slave trade and the founding of the Confederacy is worth several books. But let's move on with the chronology of what you talk about in your book. What happens, if you will, after 1862, between, 1863, 4, 5, before the war ends?
Mhm.
How does the internal slave trade work?
So I would say at some level, it reflects what we had been talking about, that it ebbs and flows along with Confederate understandings of the probability of their victory. And so remains robust in 1863. One of the things that I was struck by is that you have a large number of Confederates writing even after their defeats at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in ways that reflect continuing confidence in the slave trade and implicitly, therefore, the Confederacy. There are Confederate officers who have been recently defeated at Gettysburg and are writing to their families about how this is a great time to buy enslaved people, for
Yeah, yeah,
example.
yeah.
As you get into 1864 and eventually into 1865, this story holds true, but it gets more and more complicated, mostly because the Confederate economy is just rotten to the core. And I don't mean that purely morally,
Right.
but also the economic fundamentals of the Confederacy create real problems for anyone looking to do any kind of business. The biggest issue is inflation in the Confederate currency.
Hmm.
The Confederacy experiences an average of about 10% inflation per month for the first several years of the Civil War.
Wow.
Which, we complain and really feel the pain at 3 to 4% inflation annually. So imagine 10% per month.
Mm.
And this has a couple of contradictory effects on the business of slavery, I would say. On the one hand, it makes it very hard to do business because Confederate money is essentially, from the moment you receive it, worth less than it was 5 minutes earlier.
Right.
Basically. So, on the one hand, you have a large number of Confederates who would very much like to acquire enslaved people because they believe enslaved people are a form of property that will hold value. Almost no one believes Confederate money is going to be worth anything at the end of the war, even if the Confederacy win.
Yeah,
They
that's
still think
amazing.
that there's going to be a massive readjustment of the currency. But they believe that enslaved people will be worth an extraordinary amount of money when the war is over. And the numbers you see floated before the Civil War, an enslaved man sold for about $800 to $1,000.
Yeah.
After the Civil War, you see Confederates speculating, both literally and verbally, that after the Civil War, an enslaved man will be worth $2,000 to $3,000, $4,000, even $5,000. So multiple times what they had been before the Civil War. So inflation creates this aspiration and this desire to buy people, and you certainly see people acting on it. At the same time, it makes it very hard to actually do that, because people aren't willing to surrender potentially valuable property for money unless they think they're going to lose it,
Hmm. Hmm.
which many do as Union forces drive further and further into the Confederacy. So there's these interlocking forces: inflation, emancipation, and of course the ever-present Confederate military prospects, as well as the political prospects for the Lincoln administration. All of this kind of melds together and creates a very complicated mindset that different Confederates weigh in different ways as they're considering whether or not to buy people in late 1863 and 64, particularly. By 1865, on the one hand, things are pretty dismal for the Confederacy. It seems pretty clear from our perspective that they can't win, particularly after the fall of Atlanta and the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. That said, I was struck repeatedly in researching this book to see that Confederates continue to buy and sell people in significant numbers.
Yeah.
There is a slave trader operating in Lynchburg, Virginia, for example. He's one of the few people we have good records for throughout the war. And I was struck by how steady his sales remain throughout this period. They eventually fall off a cliff, but they remain relatively steady. He's selling about 20 people per month throughout much of late 1864 and 1865, even as, what we would see as the Confederacy's prospects for victory dwindling significantly.
Could this be because a lot of these slave traders are thinking the war might be ending soon, but it might end in a kind of a negotiated peace where we'll be allowed to have slaves and things might go back to the way they were before, rather than it'll end in ultimately the 13th Amendment.
It's a really great question. And it's I will say it's really hard to get a sense for what they actually think is going to happen, to the point that you often get Confederates sort of talking out of both sides of their mouth
Yeah.
about this
Yeah. Yeah.
question. There's a Georgian cavalryman. He has this really interesting correspondence with his father. And he says, on the one hand, you really should sell enslaved people right now because they are, the word you often see is demoralized by the war, which means functionally they see which way the wind is blowing.
Yeah.
That enslaved people believe freedom is imminent. So on the one hand, he's saying to his father, you should sell people because they know what's happening. They're demoralized and it's better to get something for them now. And then he turns right around and says, plus you can use that money to buy new people who aren't demoralized. It's sort of that contradictory mindset, I think, persists. One of the best studies of the Confederate mentality remains James Rourke's study from the late 1970s. And he says you can understand a lot if you think of these people as simply unwilling and unable to comprehend a world without slavery.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that the survival of the slave trade really speaks to that. It continues to happen simply because there is at least a subset of Confederates that Jason Phillips in his wonderful book calls diehard rebels, who simply are unwilling to give up,
Yeah.
are unwilling to surrender literally on the battlefield, but also are unwilling to surrender the project of a slaveholding nation that they believe they're fighting for.
Well, I interrupted the flow of 1865 there. So how does the internal slave trade continue as the end is coming near? I don't want to get quite to the fall of Richmond yet. I would want that as a separate question, but
I would say it continues in fits and starts increasingly as the end of the war approaches. It's compressed into a smaller and smaller area. Essentially, it continues wherever Union soldiers are not, which by the beginning of 1865 isn't that much of the
yeah, yeah,
Confederacy. Parts of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and then you have sort of sporadic slave dealing happening in Texas and the Trans-Mississippi West and places like that. But it is increasingly diminished, but is still happening. You have these remarkable stories of the Battle of the Crater outside Petersburg, for example, and you have Black soldiers who are wounded in the fighting before the crater, who end up as prisoners in Richmond and then are sold in the winter and spring of 1865 for a variety of reasons. And so you have this sporadic but still effective and still damaging slave trade that persists right up until the end of the war.
right. Well, I want to end this show by talking about the fall of Richmond. And this goes back to the introduction of your book, where you just provide the most gripping, is a term that I use a lot, but I really mean it in this case, description and story about what's going on in Richmond as it's falling, but as you, if you will, these diehard rebels are still trying to cling on to the slaves they're trying to sell, right? And they're keeping them in this certain place. But B, all around them, the Union Army is closing in. So it's an absolutely fascinating story, but my version of the story will be terrible compared to yours. So please, you tell the Buzzkillers how you describe that in your book.
Yeah, so I will say this is one of the things that drew me into the project, because there's a modestly well-known story in Civil War circles of what happens as Richmond is falling. Richmond falls pretty suddenly. Jefferson Davis famously, gets word that Robert E. Lee is planning to evacuate Petersburg, which is critical to the defense of Richmond, while Davis is attending church on a Sunday morning, and word slowly spreads out through the city, and Confederate officials are packing gold and records and things like that on train cars to shuttle them out. Confederate soldiers are swarming the streets, destroying supplies and anything that might be useful to the oncoming Union forces. And Richmond civilians some are looting, some are, they're all hungry, and so they're ransacking Confederate stores as well. And in the middle of all of this, one of Richmond's slave traders, a man named Robert Lumpkin, who'd been in the business for about 30 years by this point, moves this group of, we're told, 50 enslaved people through the streets of Richmond. You can only imagine what that must have been like, and tries to get them on board one of the last trains out of the city. He argues with one of the Confederate officials and ultimately is told, essentially, the needs of the Confederate government are greater than yours, that it's more important to get Confederate property and Confederate officials on board this train than Robert Robert Lumpkin and the 50 people he's trying to continue to hold in slavery, even as Richmond is starting to burn around him and will ultimately burn around him. On the one hand, this is a story that often shows up in Civil War books to highlight the transformation that the war causes, that the war will ultimately lead to the emancipation of, not just the 50 people held in Robert Lumpkin's slave jail, which, by the way, you can visit part of this if you're ever in Richmond. Most of the site lies under Interstate 95, unfortunately, but the city has been excavating portions of the property, and it's an incredibly moving site if you're ever able to visit. But I would say it sparked my interest in the project to think, okay, not what is this about to mean for those people, but why is Robert Lumpkin trying to do this in the first place? Why does he think this is going to work? And what's really remarkable is that this is not an isolated incident. Slave traders try to do the same thing in Savannah right before Sherman's army arrives. And you have Confederate soldiers retreating towards Appomattox with Robert E. Lee's army, which is sort of a pell-mell movement to the west. And yet you have Confederate soldiers trying to stop and buy people as they're retreating to Appomattox. You could treat this as an isolated incident, except for there's so many other people trying to do essentially the same thing. And I think that that is so telling about the degree to which Confederates clung to the institution of slavery, the degree to which it's bound up with what they understand themselves to be fighting for, and the prominence of slavery in the world that Confederates were striving to build.
I often think case studies and vignettes and things like that are overused in history and overemployed in history books, but that's certainly not the case in this one. It is just fascinating, just fascinating. Well, thank you, Dr. Colby, so much for coming on the show. Buzzkillers, there's so much more about this in the book than we've talked about and that we've had time to talk about. And of course, the book is on the Buzzkill bookshelf and Unholy Traffic. Please get it right away. It will, and I mean this deeply, it will change your views about the Civil War. And just showing the complexity is enough to change your views about the Civil War. So, again, Dr. Colby, thanks a million for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of the show, and it's good to finally be part of it.
And we'll hope you'll come back. So, Buzzkillers out there, we will talk to all of you next week.